Well, before we take any more rides on the mothership, let's take a ride over to the newest hit series on Vice TV, Who Killed WCW? Where we saw the first episode, the second of the four-parters this week, Tuesday night, 10 o'clock Eastern Time. Check your local listings where it applies. And, so far, it was an uneventful first episode because you have to explain who the victim is before you commit the murder, right? You can't just kill some random person. So this was setting up the preamble to WCW and how it got successful enough to be killed. But it was kind of it's the Eric Bischoff show, the Eric Bischoff explanation so far. Some other talking heads come into it that hopefully we'll hear more from them. But they started in 1992-93 with Bischoff's arrival. And as I was telling you before we started recording, they skipped the first 5 years where, in effect, who killed WCW which time? They killed it once before, they resurrected it, and then killed it again. And we're coming in on the start of the second life. So I thought, and I know we've talked about the various problems when TBS bought the company from Crockett and what all went on, but as a preamble to this establishing show, I think we ought to establish more of how they got to the point where they started. Shouldn't we? Does that make sense?
When you think about everything that happened in 1988, and then, of course, the road to Eric Bischoff getting there, and Eric Bischoff, according to this, never even heard of WCW before.
He'd been working for Vern Gagne for 5 years, and he never watched another wrestling show. He was trying to, more on him in a minute.
But I think the documentary had a lot of the voices who were there in the mid-90s and the late 90s in terms of the Turner side. But the players who were there in the early 90s, the Jack Petricks, the Jim Herds, again, like you said, that was the first death, that whole bunch.
Yeah. And Kevin Sullivan is on this show, and I'm sure he probably made comments about it, but and I understand it would have needed to have been an 8-part series, blah, blah, blah. But it's fascinating because they killed the same victim twice, just more dramatically the second time. But go ahead.
No, that was kind of my point. The Turner executives from that point in 88, up until, when Jim Herd left in, 91, like there was no real representation of what it was there because Bischoff did a good job up to a point, obviously. Look at what happened with WCW, although I'm not saying he killed WCW. But Bischoff had an advantage that no one else had, because Bischoff got Turner to open up the books in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
From Turner Home Entertainment not getting all the pay-per-view money, to, who subsidized, what division subsidized what contract, to getting TV rights. These were things that Bill Watts didn't get, Kip Fry didn't get, Jim Herd didn't get, nobody got.
Well, and part of that, and let me at the outset, before we go back in time a little bit, before Bischoff, let me give Eric all the credit in the world for, he found his niche in wrestling eventually. He is a world-class television performer. As being Eric Bischoff, the evil promoter or promotion owner or whatever, he couldn't do anything physical. He may be a karate expert, but we saw when he tried to work, Jesus H. Christ. And so he was never a wrestling, even Vince, my God, could, at his age did that. He didn't have matches, but as a personality and as that heel authority figure or instigator or whatever, he's fucking brilliant. Because as with many of us in the industry, try to stay as true to life to your real character as possible in some instances, right? And that's what we got. Because the thing about, he was a salesman, and he says that, and he was, and you can tell because he's charming. And he's got a tremendous line of bullshit. And you can see how that he could sell people on that he knew shit that he knew nothing about whatsoever. And he blustered his way through a lot of this stuff just by having the glibness that either the wrestling people never talked to the Turner people in the right way because they couldn't. They spoke two different languages. And the Turner people didn't understand wrestling, and the wrestling people didn't understand the Turner people. Bischoff didn't understand wrestling, but he knew how to sell shit and he knew how to manipulate, because that's part of the thing he'd been doing, selling commercials or selling TV time or selling TV shows to television people. And so that's why he was able to bluster, bluff, and in some cases just sell his way into not only that job, and we've talked about the fake letters of recommendation. He had, people in the AWA. Poor old Mike Shields wrote one for TBS down there. So it was all a sales pitch that people bought. And he got into the spot. And then, as we are going to start to see later on in further episodes of the program, then he didn't know anything about wrestling, and he's trying to, figure out who to listen to and pick some of the wrong people. But where I took the first part that I took exception with, that Eric said, well, and it makes him look grander. It was this little Southern promotion that nobody ever thought was going to be successful.
Oh, they actually showed a clip of you behind that when he said it.
Oh, yes. Well, in all honesty, I think because this was the Dark Side of the Ring guys, Evan and Jason, the headlines about TBS buys Crockett interests, that was my B-roll from my archives. So they probably put a little shot in him of me to thank me there. But that's the point that Bischoff is trying to make, is, this little small promotion that nobody ever thought would be successful. And it was like it was a shits. TBS purchased the only competitor to Vince McMahon in the world, in the professional wrestling industry, at a time where it was closer, really, than it would ever get again, except for the Attitude Era. And in the space of a year and a half, turned it into a fucking moribund promotion that was so far out of fucking first place that it wasn't even funny. And it pretty much killed it again and turned the Turner Broadcasting executives against it. Because they were, Turner Broadcasting everybody in Turner Broadcasting didn't hate WCW when they bought it. Yes, there were some naysayers, but Steve Chamberlain was the guy in charge of Turner Home Entertainment. He loved the tapes. He loved this is going to be great. He's the one that was arranging for me to do all the home video commercials when they'd release a videotape. I've said Starrcade 86, that was the first tape that Turner Home Entertainment did with Crockett, was the first wrestling video that went gold before any events. Think about that. Because they pumped that commercial every week on the TBS show multiple times. That's why so many people saw me fall off that scaffold. Vince never pushed a video like that of WrestleMania that hard. And so Steve Chamberlain to Turner Home Entertainment, they were, oh yeah. There was a guy named Jeff Carr, who I believe was, I don't remember his title, but he was in programming. And he was always at the TBS studio tapings at the start, and a lot of them were involved. By 89, Chip Burnham, who was one of they had a guy on this show that was the comptroller, which is a fancy name for the accountant, right? The guy who determines where money's going.
Right.
Well, Chip Burnham was from that department. And they ended up sending him on the road where he'd come in and give guys draws. And a draw for, in wrestling, a draw was an advance on your payoff for the night. And usually in a territory, it's like you need a draw, $50, whatever, but they would give guys $200 draws. And then at the end of the week, the guy wouldn't have a fucking check. But Chip was pushing money on people like a goddamn drug pusher. You want to draw? You want to draw? No, Chip, just give me my fucking check. I'm fine. And all the other guys, they're seeing these horrible houses. They're thinking, yeah, give me the draw. Somehow I'll make money on that. But anyway, they liked it. They were into the idea of having the wrestling promotion, this highly rated television product that they'd had on their air. Now they own the thing, the videos, the guys in commercials. Remember the seasons beating? They flew me down to Atlanta just to do a 30-second fucking commercial for the live TBS special. So they were all into it. And then they hired Jim Herd. And they hired Jim Herd because Jack Petrick, his wife knew who the fuck Jim Herd was because his wife was friends with Herd's wife. That is legitimately the goddamn story, folks. And because, as we've mentioned, he had worked as a studio director at KPLR in St. Louis when Muchnick did the wrestling show. And I'm not going to...
And learn nothing.
And learn nothing because they didn't smarten the fucking TV crew up then. He read the formats. You know, he knew what match was coming up. But anyway, I'm not going to make this about Herd, but when you skip Herd, I'm sorry, but you skip the first death of WCW. He was the guy who made the only competitor to the WWF in 1988 into a joke that was not profitable for 8 fucking years. And that's what happened the first time around. As far as talent, we were talking about it, and we're going to review the Steamboat biography on the Drive-Thru. Look at the talent that he was single-handedly credited with from their own lips. I left because of this fucking guy. Ric Flair, the Road Warriors and Paul Ellering, Ricky Steamboat, Jim Cornette, Stan Lane, Terry Funk. He retired Terry Funk against his fucking will, made him an announcer. So he didn't stick around after his contract was up. It was a joke. The originator of the Ding Dongs. So by 1991, it was not even throughout the 70s and early 80s when TBS first became a cable entity. People, when they got the opportunity to get cable, you couldn't just sign up for it. Many markets didn't have it at all. Louisville didn't get cable, or at least my mother could not get cable at this house until after I moved away in 1983. But the point is, anybody who had the opportunity to get cable that was a wrestling fan got cable for TBS for Georgia Championship Wrestling. It was the highest rated program on cable television. Not wrestling program, but program. And then by all the twists and turns that we've talked about, when Crockett got the TBS time slot in 1985 and the deal Black Saturday, the whole 9 yards, not only were Crockett's syndicated ratings in the various markets comparable to Vince's, but the TBS program was still more highly viewed than Vince's primetime wrestling or All-American or the other cable programs that he had at the time. The ratings were very close. The talent rosters, depending on personal preference for the early through mid 80s, they were comparable. And Vince grossed from 1985 on, thanks to WrestleMania, hopping in on pay-per-view and running more live events, having more wrestlers under contract. Where Vince was running 3 nights a week, Crockett might be running twice. Vince was grossing probably 3 times what Crockett was, but if you go with profit margin, they were closer than that because Crockett was grossing less but spending less. So it wasn't a goddamn runaway until 1988. And by 1990, it was a goddamn rout. Am I lying or exaggerating anything here?
No, a variety of things got it to the point where it got in 1988. And some of them are booking related, but a lot of them are Vince McMahon being competitive related. Screwing Starrcade. I mean, that was kind of the final nail in the coffin, really, if you think about it. Even though it's a year earlier than the sale, that was it. Once that happened, that was it.
You were looking at a Crockett family business in North Carolina with 7 employees and this blah 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 conglomerate that Vince was putting together. And they were outmanned and outgunned, but the product and outfinanced, the product that was being presented and the popularity of same, again, from 1986 to 1988, would never be closer again for the next 8 years.
Yeah.
If what we were excited about when we heard TBS was buying the thing was that goddamn all we've needed is money and television and pay-per-view that we couldn't get on because we were just fucking Crockett from Charlotte, North Carolina. This is Ted Turner. We're not gonna go broke, or tap into old Mother Crockett's retirement account to compete with Vince McMahon, and they can not only already have us on TV but can get us on full-fledged pay-per-view. Great. We didn't know that they were going to buy something that was one thing and turn it into another thing by putting people in charge. And this has historically been the thing when corporations get involved in wrestling. They put people in charge that either don't know anything about the fucking product or listen to the wrong people who they think do know about the product. And I mean, whether it's Jim Herd who killed WCW, Jim Herd should be convicted of war crimes in Nuremberg, because that was what really it soured the TBS executives on wrestling to when by the time 5 years later, when Bischoff does get there, the people that never wanted it to begin with have won over many of the others, and the people have left and people have changed hands, and all some of these people ever saw was this fucking joke that didn't make any money and lost money.
Well, the other thing too is it's a personal issue, or it's about the person, I should say. I said before how Bischoff had a lot of advantages no one else had before him. A lot of that's on Bischoff being able to be that liaison between the wrestling company and the rest of Turner. Bill Watts, for all of his positives, could not coexist with other executives of any sort.
No.
Kip Fry was a short-term thing, didn't know what he was doing, but he knew how to throw around a lot of money.
You know what Watts called him? Francis Ford Coppola. He was paying multi-millions of dollars to make major motion pictures.
And then Jim Herd always struck me as the kind of guy who became an executive, but wasn't an executive. Bischoff was driven.
Herd got mad that he didn't know anything about what he was talking about, so he had to then tell you what to do because to show that he knew what he was talking about.
Bischoff saw he had an opportunity and said, how do I figure out how to make this work or make it a positive or keep it going? Because he wanted, it's self-preservation, obviously.
Yeah.
Herd didn't have that. Herd was, from all accounts, I wasn't there, just a cocky, obnoxious know-it-all who knew nothing.
Yes.
But I think that's the thing. Bischoff was the right guy to understand how to deal with executives from, especially the television division.
Well, and that's the thing. Before we dive into this actual program, I gave my impression of Eric as far as a performer. And I never worked with him when he was in any position of authority in any promotion. As we've told some stories, I was always on the other side of jousting from somewhere else. But I have heard from a variety of people whose opinions about wrestling that I would take because of their long tenure in it, that you would be surprised how little Eric Bischoff to this day still knows about wrestling. but because of the force of his personality and or his persuasive, charming manner and or the fact that he has worked for the big companies, he can still convince some people who don't know very much about wrestling that he knows a lot about wrestling. And see, this is the first time that this story has been told by a non WWE entity, but it still doesn't mean that it's completely factual and not history being rewritten by the victor, because Bischoff, he's trying to make it a victory for him by absolving himself of responsibility for the deceasement of the corpse. So you have to take it with a grain of salt when he's telling his story, because he's trying to plead his case in court and get out of the guilty verdict. But we're going to find out this is like a Murder on the Orient Express type of thing, where there's a lot of people that are culpable for the crime. But Brian, anyway, so that in 1988, when they bought the thing, November 1st, that fateful, infamous day, a day that will live in infamy, through about 1993, they had diminished the wrestling promotion, formerly NWA, Crockett, WCW, whatever, into a thing where I was drawing more people for the Smoky Mountain Wrestling shows in Knoxville at the Coliseum than they were in either the Omni in Atlanta or the Civic Center in Philadelphia. Remember, they did 600 people in Philadelphia one night at the Civic Center. And that's what Eric Bischoff came into. So was there, in some respects, almost any way to go but up?
No, I mean, you couldn't go further down. I mean, I don't know how to answer. You couldn't go further down. But, you know, again, it wasn't, that's the thing that Bischoff, I think, got that Herd didn't. You know, Bischoff, like you said, may not be a bastion of wrestling honesty or knowledge, but he knew how to sell a package. Goes back to him being a salesman. So he could pretend like he knew about booking and shit. Whether he did or didn't matter. He knew how to sell everything around it to the people above him.
Yeah, well, and let's objectively...
Until he got to a certain point, and then, you know, everything blew up.
Yeah, and let's objectively talk about that for a second. When we get to 1992, 93, what is his experience in the professional wrestling business? He told the story himself. He and Sonny Ono, who apparently really was a friend of him, and that a friend of his, and he just brought him into wrestling business for some fucking reason. Put him on national television. Eric is a precursor of Tony Khan. Put my friends on TV. But they were selling a board game or a kid's game, the Ninja Star Wars thing.
It wasn't a board game. It was kind of like a laser tag.
A laser tag thing. Yeah. Well, I meant board, but they throw the things with the Velcro.
Until George Lucas heard they got what Star Wars? What?
Yeah. It turned in from ninja to nunya. But anyway, so they want to buy time on the AWA wrestling program on ESPN, and he calls Vern Gagne. And think about, this is 1987. This is the dying days of the AWA, where the business was down, talent was down, Vern's local TVs had been decimated by Vince's invasion. He got the afternoon time slot on ESPN for some reruns and some new programs. And they needed every, source of income they could get. And Vern at that time, what was he? He was 1987. He'd been in his early 60s. And he probably heard this glib guy and said, hey, we got this TV, sell my TV. Syndicate my TV, get me on stations, or sell the time on my TV, or whatever. And that's the way that Bischoff gets a job in wrestling. Okay, let's say he wants to learn booking. I mean, let's be honest. We've talked about the AWA was a tremendous territory at one point, but by 1987, good Lord. And who was their booker and what great booking was going on at that point. And if you're learning the wrestling business from Vern at that point, he's been in the business for 40 years. But as you'll recall, he didn't change a lot. I look like a chameleon next to the way Vern Gagne changed with the times. And then they make him a TV announcer because all their TV announcers were dying of old age. And he looked like John Davidson. But what was there even an AWA? When did the AWA officially go out of business? Probably right after Bischoff left, right?
91, yeah.
Well, no, maybe right before.
Because that's where I first saw him on Sports Channel in New York. One weeknight, all of a sudden AWA was on. I was a kid. And Eric Bischoff was one of the hosts. They had Yukon John Nord and the Timekeeper, Mike George, all these great gimmicks. Team Challenge series. But I'd seen him there. And then AWA by early 91 was completely done. And that's around the time he showed up in WCW, 91.
And it would have been done beforehand had not Vern Gagne made a fortune in the wrestling business when he was one of the most powerful people in it, but it limped to a finish. So, and Google this for me, if you will. Oh, master of the Google platform. How old is Eric Bischoff? Because they had his wife on to say that in 1992, he was trying to sell this Ninja Star Wars game on wrestling television. They were making no money. They were bouncing checks.
Not 92. I think that would have Ninja Star Wars on TV would have been 87, 88.
87.
Yeah.
Okay. But then later on they said, that's when Bischoff said when he got the job in TBS, because Larry Zbyszko, who'd worked for Vern and was the son-in-law, plugged him, right? He said, yes, I was the happiest third-string announcer to get a job. In 92, he was making no money. Vern couldn't pay him. So that's the point is he was selling a fucking Ninja Star Wars game, trying to sell it on wrestling TV in 1987. He gets a job with Vern Gagne, but then Vern can't pay him, and they're bouncing checks, and he gets a job with TBS that at least guarantees him some money, and they're happy as clams. How old is Eric Bischoff?
And he had also auditioned for WWE in between that period of time. Eric Bischoff is 69 years old.
Good Lord. I didn't realize he was so elderly.
He was good for his age.
Well, he looks good for his age, but look at his fucking age. But nevertheless, so if 1987 was 37 years ago, that means he was 32 years old. He's trying to sell games on wrestling television, and 5 years later, he's 37 years old, and they're bouncing checks. How does he got to be in his mid-30s without having a fucking, at least a comfortable means of support and some kind of career? And they're back. And how does he keep going bankrupt? Did he just go bankrupt a few years ago?
I believe he did. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what that has to do with this. I don't know why you're...
No, can he not manage his money? How the fuck does this keep happening with all his adult life that he's doing all his television and working for all his big companies, and he keeps going bankrupt and bouncing checks? What the fuck? I thought he produced TV shows with Jason Hervey and things. I might not be a fan of all the shows that he's produced. Certainly there were some shows, right, that they produced.
I don't think they've worked together in a long time, so I don't think that's an active thing right now.
Well, goddamn, does he not know how to invest his finances carefully? He keeps getting in between a rock and a hard place.
Well, yeah, maybe just, things happen in life. You never know.
But anyway, so the point is that was his experience in pro wrestling. He's a salesman and an announcer for Vern Gagne in the dying days of his promotion. And then
Do you know why he became an announcer? Do you know why he became an announcer?
Because look at him.
No. Do you know why they had to push him on the air?
Why?
Because Larry Nelson went on a coke binge and never came back.
That's right. I'm sorry, I've heard that story.
Yeah, it's in his book, his wild and wacky book about the AWA late 80s hotel antics. Check it out wherever you find your favorite books.
And but poor Larry Nelson. But so the point, that's his experience in wrestling, and then within a year after he becomes the number 3 announcer in WCW, that's when he gives the executives a line of bullshit that he's fabulous at. He's like a fucking good-looking Heyman, and they hire him to run the fucking thing. And he bullshits them into fucking spending some money on it and doing some halfway decent accounting for once. But
do you see any similarities with the way Vince Russo got in?
Yes. Have a good line of bullshit at a period of time when people have given up all other hope, and then bluster into a goddamn accidental fucking successful period that you have no idea how you got into, accidentally probably, and then you don't know where it's going and you can't get it out of it, and you crash and burn. Which is why Jerry Jarrett said the measure of success in the wrestling industry is either, over the long term, is either the number of places that you have excelled in or the length of time that you have excelled in a certain place. And they fit neither of those categories.
Although I would label Bischoff a much bigger success.
Much bigger success.
Much bigger
yes,
success than Vince Russo.
I'm talking about in wrestling administration. Bischoff is a great television performer, and he'll be that from now on. There's no age limit on that, or whatever. But as far as wrestling administration, he had about as long as old Shitstain did at wrestling writing that was successful, and then they've tried to relive it ever since, and it ain't worked because it was accidental to begin with. But anyway, that is where we begin the first episode.
But if I could just say something, you didn't even really mention it. You're talking about the death of WCW. 91 was a depressing period. The period where you actually sent the funeral wreath.
Yes.
When Flair left the company and the fans in Baltimore took over the pay-per-view with "We Want Flair" chants.
Yeah.
That felt like the death of the company to me as a kid. Right there.
Yeah,
Summer of 91.
That was kind of, because they made almost the complete break, because now, again, there was no Ric Flair. There was no Midnight Express and Jim Cornette. There was no, and I want to add to the list of the people that Hurd ran off, Tully Blanchard, who he blocked completely. There was no Four Horsemen. There was no Rock and Roll Express. There was no really major connection besides Sting and Luger to the glory days of Crockett, and to the period that those people remembered most fondly. And and it didn't resemble, it was starting to be a light version and a copy version of the WWF rather than the World Championship Wrestling that they had come to know. And that's when people just left in drooves, I say.
Yeah. Everyone, when I first started watching NWA in 89, by 91, other than like you said, the Steiners were still there, but not for long. Luger was still there, but not for long. Sting would stay there. But Muta was gone, even though it's a different circumstance. Muta was gone, Steamboat was gone, Terry Funk was gone, Sid Vicious was gone, Road Warriors were gone. Mean Mark popped up, he was gone. Like, just anyone who showed any promise disappeared. Any of your favorites were just one day gone off TV.
Well, and 4 or 5 different bookers a year will do that to you. But anyway, that's, as I mentioned, that's where we started here, and we won't go as long as Mama Cornette used to say, it won't be as long as it's been. But I have to preface this, Brian, with this question. WCW, Turner Broadcasting, has bought a company that had a great competitive product, was underfinanced, and had undergone a recession that it had nipped back up out of. And within 2 years, they turned it into the lowest drawing national television promotion pretty much in history until TNA came along. And I'm wondering, when 1993 comes about, it's been 5 years, what are the odds they're going to get it right the second time? What do you think the over-under was, the more or less? Were they going to kill it more, or were they going to kill it less?
If you're asking me what people thought in 93 or leading into 93, I think people thought
Yeah.
WCW was going to continue to die because there was no real hope of anyone turning it around.
Well, see, if there had been a thing called DraftKings back then, you probably could have won some money on that, because that's probably what you would have been saying in 1993, and that's what happened for another 3 years at least. And that's why everybody needs to have the brand new app from our friends at DraftKings, a new fantasy game. Depends on what kind of fantasies you've got as to whether you're over or under. But it's called Pick Six. And now that there's still NBA playoffing, because they do that, holy Jesus, I would say every day of the year, apparently, as long as we've been plugging it. Well, if you get more or less of a stat on the rebounds, the points, the assists, all that stuff, well, then you can win huge cash prizes if you use our code letters. See, this is all an under the table thing. The government is not supposed to know. This money's changing hands under very tenuous circumstances, so you got to use the code JCE after you download the DraftKings Pick Six app, and then you pick more or less of a stat between 2 and 6 players. And then you go up to the door and you do the secret knock. And when they open a door, you pull out your gat, you say, freeze.
No, you don't do that.
Up.
No, metaphorically speaking, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, you're gonna end up with all the money.
You're not pulling your gat out at anyone.
Not pulling your gat? Well, you're gonna end up with all the money. Whether you're gatter or gatless, you're gonna end up with all the money. And just download the Pick Six app from DraftKings.
Use your mental gat.
Yes. And you're not shooting blanks when you're picking more or less of these stats and all the ways that the fantasy people know how to do things. You can do them here and win money. And right now, they pack more fun into less time. Well, that's always good, especially as you get older. Right now, if you use the code JCE, new customers are going to play $5 and get 50 in Pick Six credits. JCE is the code, and if you play with $5, they give you 50 in the credits that you can then give back to them in playing the games. And you'll make a ton of money someday. Only on DraftKings Pick Six, the crown is yours. Did
he's still not back from the shore.
Stuffington? Jasper Stuffington? I thought he was our VO guy.
He doesn't use his real name. I don't know why you would use his real name. That violates some kind of HIPAA or OSHA or...
HIPAA?
HIPAA?
Well, I'll tell you this. I'm a hypochondriac. Folks, I will remind you on this DraftKings Pick Six disclaimer, 1 per new customer, non-withdrawable. Pick Six credits expire in 6 months. Limited time offer. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. 18 plus in most eligible states. Not available in all states, including New York and Connecticut. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See the terms now at picksix.draftkings.com/promos. And good luck to you all.
That's right. The crown is yours.
The crown is yours.